And so today we'll be talking about Chapter 5, Section 2, and the title of this is Drafting the Constitution. And so now at the Philadelphia Convention, which after all it was called the Philadelphia Convention because that was the original capital of our nation. When this group met in 1787, just 2 years before the signing of the U.S. Constitution, just 2 years before the election of George Washington and the creation of the Supreme Court, in 1787, delegates met to formally reject the Articles of Confederation for reasons that we looked at yesterday, and to create a new Constitution. Now, the Articles of Confederation had many problems with it, just like we looked at yesterday. And these problems perhaps were best expressed in the anger that farmers felt over taxes levied on what they produced. And when these farmers could not afford to pay these taxes, they often lost their homes, their property, and they became angry. In fact, a former Revolutionary War officer named Daniel Shea led a rebellion of farmers, and his demand was that any court that was going to take a farmer's home away from them must be shut down. And this was called Shea's Rebellion. In fact, he was able to rally enough farmers that it took the Massachusetts State Militia to put this down. So in effect, they had to call out the National Guard to put down an armed uprising against the United States of America just 3 years after the Revolutionary War was over. That's why I compared it to the Arab Spring yesterday. Now, many leaders feared that this rebellion could spread and lead to the destruction of our country. Just a few years after we started, now we're having to wonder whether or not we're going to make it. And so George Washington, still not a president at this time, but very influential, he was the officer in charge of the Continental Army, expressed a need for a stronger government. If we can't enforce our own laws, we will cease to exist. Now, 5 states sent delegates to a meeting on interstate trade. That means trade or commerce between different states. This is an essential function of a national government. Because if we have a trade dispute, if I say I've got these 5 comic books, Wesley, what do you give me? Okay, you'll give me this basketball. Great. Now, the basketball he gives me has a leak in it. It looks great. I give him the 5 comic books, but I find out later it has a leak in it. We now have a trade dispute. I go to Wesley and I say, hey, Wesley, this basketball has a leak. He says, well, tough. Trade's over. Well, what do I do? Well, okay, so we could engage in an altercation. That's not exactly a great idea, and on the large scale, that's not going to help peace and prosperity, so that's going to end badly for both of us. We could go to an outside party, local government. In this case, we would just go to Miss Cottle and say, Miss Cottle, the basketball leaks. And Wesley says tough. And then she'll make a ruling, perhaps, and that would be our local government. And, again, she would be resolving our trade dispute. But what do you do if the 2 parties engaging in trade belong to 2 different governments? Who settles it then? Well, it depends on the organization. But ideally, within a national government, if the 2 parties are from different states, it would be the national government's job to resolve that difference. And meanwhile, 5 states sent delegates to a meeting on interstate trade to decide the rules of how to handle that very thing. Now, Shays' rebellion prompted 12 of the 13 states to join the movement for the Constitutional Convention. And so that means that when Daniel Shay rose up, because they couldn't or they wouldn't pay their taxes, states began to quickly realize that unless we formed some kind of stronger central government, kaput, it's over. And so James Madison, very important, influential figure, representative of Virginia, is now today known as the father of our Constitution. Now, a little about this convention. In 1787, 55 delegates met in Pennsylvania at the State House. This was a secret meeting. In fact, the windows of this building were kept shut because they didn't want people eavesdropping. They didn't want people listening in. It needed to be decided in secret how we would establish this union, and we didn't want any outside interference. Meanwhile, Washington was unanimously elected the presiding officer of this meeting. Goes to show just how much people thought of him. And this would become the Constitutional Convention, the group that would meet and decide on what we would put in this Constitution. Just because they could all agree on who should run the show, it doesn't mean they all agreed on everything. In fact, there was quite a few big differences represented at this meeting. The delegates, the representatives, recognized the need to make our government stronger. Shays' rebellion convinced practically everyone of the need for a strong central government. And so we needed a new form of government. But there were a couple of different plans for how this government should be organized. And if you remember, the Articles of Confederation was quite a mess. Each state got one vote. For anything to be passed, all the states had to agree on it. And unfortunately, we saw several different cases where one state held up the whole process. For example, Rhode Island held up the process of deciding how to collect taxes to pay off our national debt. And as such, Britain maintained forts on our border, Spain closed off the Mississippi, and we were in deep trouble just because we couldn't all get along and agree. So Madison, meanwhile, came up with a plan. He said, we need a legislative branch of government, those who make laws, And it needs to have two houses, just like the British model. It needs a House of Representatives and a Senate. Well, the British called it the House of Lords and House of Commons. Same basic principle. But both of these houses need to send representatives based on the population of those states. So Madison's plan said that really states are just lines. They have their own governments, but in terms of a national government, we need to be thinking about representing people equally. It doesn't matter about state to state. And so that was his plan, was a bicameral legislature where the representatives decided would be chosen on the basis of the population of a state only. For example, North Carolina might get 9. New York might get 12 because New York has a bigger population than North Carolina. And then smaller states like Rhode Island might only get 3. Now William Paterson, and by the way, that was called the Virginia Plan, Madison's plan based on population, the Virginia Plan. Now William Paterson and his New Jersey plan was entirely focused on states' rights. And that is that one state got 1 vote. So he would have been somewhat a fan of the Articles of Confederation because that's exactly what they already had. And so the New Jersey plan was just a continuation of the Articles of Confederation. One state gets 1 vote. But now Madison was onto something in regards to population. Because it's really not fair and it's not equal representation if New York gets 1 vote and Rhode Island gets 1 vote. Because New York represents millions of people and Rhode Island only tens of thousands at this time. So 1 per state is not equal representation. 1 per state is not fair. It doesn't work. So meanwhile, Roger Sherman, a delegate from Connecticut, proposed the Great Compromise. Now, the Great Compromise resolved this problem. The Senate would have equal representation. We decided 2 per state, so 2 votes per state. That's the New Jersey plan. That's kind of a portion of the Articles of Confederation, preserving states' rights by ensuring that each state has an equal share at the table. However, they were also going to incorporate James Madison's plan called the Virginia Plan, and the Virginia Plan, of course, based on population. And this is what we have today. A bicameral legislature, meaning 2 houses. So 2 houses. One is the House of Representatives, based on Madison's Virginia Plan, where the representatives are chosen based on the population of that state. The other is, of course, the Senate. And the Senate has 2 senators per state. No matter the size of the state, no matter the population of the state, it doesn't matter. Each senator, there are 2 of these from each state. That was the resolution, and we call it the Great Compromise. But of course, slavery is a concern, even during the writing of the Constitution. The southern states, because we have to ask ourselves first, if we're going to factor in a state's population into the amount of representation they have, essentially the amount of power a state has on the national level. So if we're going to factor population, do slaves count? And this was a legitimate question that people were asking at the time. Because you see, the South wanted these slaves to count. Even though they were considered property, even though they couldn't vote, even though they had no rights whatsoever, they wanted slaves to count in their population. However, they didn't want slaves to count in regards to taxes. Meaning if the amount of taxes collected per state was based on population, they didn't want slaves to count in regards to taxes, but they did want them to count in regards to representation. This is a mess. Here we are 5 years into a country and we're already fighting about slavery. Pretty good preview of what's to come. Meanwhile, the North did want slaves to count for taxes because they didn't have slaves. Northern states had already abolished slavery for the most part. But they didn't want slaves to count in regards to representation. So really, here are states looking after their own self-interest, just like Adam Smith predicted they would. Now, if you also remember, the Dickensian theory, James Dickinson said that in the end, for democracy to function, people have to put their interest aside and the needs of the greater good. And that's where really the Constitution represents a series of compromises. Now, in regards to the slavery question, and we're not settling the question of whether or not slavery should be legal at this point. We've got about another 87 years to go before we get to that point. But at this time, the question was purely on, should we count slaves in regards to representation in Congress? And so the 3/5 compromise agreed that 3/5 of the slave states could be counted. So 3 out of every 5 slaves could be counted in regards to representation in Congress. Meanwhile, Congress would be given the power to regulate foreign trade. And as a result of the 3/5 compromise, which the South eventually agreed to, Congress also promised not to interfere with the slave trade for another 20 years. It would be revisited at a later time. Now, perhaps the biggest problem with the Articles of Confederation was that there was no effective enforcement of laws that were created. There was no effective separation of powers. There was no effective balance of power between the states and the federal government, because unless all the states could agree, nothing could get done. So essentially all the states functioned as independent countries, and we had a big mess. Federalism is the division of power between states and the national government. Because again, like I said, the failure of the Articles of Confederation was that states and the national government, that the national government had no power over the states. They really had no power. There was not much of a national government to speak of. And so meanwhile, we established the Constitution under the theory of federalism. And that is that the national government has delegated, or what we legally call enumerated powers. And these powers are to handle foreign affairs, relationships with other countries, to handle defense, because that is a national concern. To attack Virginia is to attack the entire country. To attack Montana is to attack the entire country. We have to rally the nation for the common defense. And then finally, interstate trade, because just like we said, if we are going to engage in trade between states, it has to be the national government that will resolve the inevitable disputes that we will have. And then finally, money. One of the huge failures of the Articles of Confederation is that each state made their own form of currency. I mean, we really were different countries until the Constitution. We had our own currencies. We had our own laws. And we had no true national government. And so federalism set up who does what and how do we make it work. Meanwhile, everything that I didn't just list belonged to the states. Everything that I didn't just list belonged to the states. In fact, that's the 10th Amendment, is that everything that the previous 9 didn't just list, it's up to the states to figure out. So federalism is meant to be a balance of power, respecting North Carolina's right to do their thing, as long as they don't break the big ones. That's federalism. Now, the powers kept to the states are called reserved powers. The states are going to handle things like education, marriage, and trade within the state. But of course, when it's trade that extends beyond the state, that's a national concern. Now, Those are called reserve powers, powers reserved specifically for the state. But remember to ask questions if you don't understand. So those are reserved powers. And then there are what we call shared powers. These are powers that both the state and the federal government, these are things they both engage in, such as the right to tax. For example, your paycheck when you start working is going to include deductions from both state taxes and federal taxes. Now, the federal tax is the bigger one of the two, but also a lot of that federal tax money comes back to our state and comes back to you guys. It doesn't just go to buy new helicopters, new missiles, and new whatever, new interstate highways. No, a good chunk of that federal tax comes right back to you. So really the collection of taxes is both a federal and a state responsibility. Borrowing money, our national debt, again, a shared power. And then finally the court system, a shared power. Federalism is also based on Montesquieu's concept of a separation of powers. That we should have three basic branches of government. And this was another failure of the Articles of Confederation. They only had a legislature. But what do they do if there's an emergency? Well, they just have to sit around and argue. They can't do anything if there's an emergency. That's why we have an executive. Because a president can respond to an emergency and allow Congress to argue about it while that individual solves the problem. That's the job of the executive branch. They carry out the laws. They respond to crises. They can handle situations immediately. But of course the legislative branch we've already been discussing, they are the group that makes laws. But then also there must be a judicial branch of government. And this is the group that interprets laws. So if Congress passes a law and we have a disagreement over what that law means, then it has to be decided in the courts. If ever you get in trouble and you find that while forming your defense, there is a problem with the policy, then you have a right to dispute that policy. You know, if you're ever accused of plagiarizing an essay, but you think that there is a problem with the definition of plagiarism, you know, the current standing in our college is 5 words that match or more in a row. And I try to be reasonable in how I interpret that. But you also have the right to interpret that. So again, if you find the problem in the policy, you have a right to ask that it be reinterpreted. And then that would be a matter for us to look at together. Well, that's the job of the courts, is that anytime there is a dispute involving a law, then either A, somebody made a bonehead mistake and just screwed up, or B, someone misinterpreted that rule, or they just simply have a different interpretation. And that has to go to a group of individuals whose job it is to interpret these laws. And they examine those cases. And the history of the Supreme Court is full of cases of people saying, I read the law this way, and I read the law this way. And then finally, the Electoral College. And the Electoral College is how we decide who is going to be the president. And it gets a little confusing, and that's why I provided the infographic here for you. You see, when we have a presidential election, you're going to hear a lot about individual states. Not a lot, you know, you'll hear about what's called the popular vote, and you'll hear that word thrown around often. Now, the popular vote means out of all the people in the country, who voted for whom, and how many voted for each individual. That's the popular vote. But you're also going to hear about the electoral votes, because ultimately that's what wins elections. And the electoral votes are decided based on, guess what, the amount of representatives in each state. It's back to that great compromise. Back to that idea of, yes, we want to represent our population fairly in elections, but also we want to preserve a state's right to sovereignty. And then finally, in the end of the day, they came up with the Constitution. Yay. We didn't just fall apart. And it's a great document. It's really amazing and worth reading. But even the Founding Fathers realized they weren't going to get it all right on the first try. And even the Founding Fathers realized that things would come up. And that, again, slavery was in the back of a lot of people's minds. And it would take 87 years, but eventually it would be added in the Constitution that slavery was illegal. It just took a little civil war, 500,000 dead, small affair to make that happen. We'll get to that later.
And last, the three-ring government.
Gonna have a three-ring circus someday. People will say it's a fine one, son. Gonna have a three-ring circus someday. People will come from miles around. Lions, tigers, acrobats and jugglers and clowns galore. Tightrope walkers, pony riders, elephants and so much more. Guess I got the idea right here at school. Felt like a fool when they called my name, talking about the government and how it's arranged, divided in three like a circus. Ring one, executive. Two is legislative, that's Congress. Ring three, judiciary. See, it's kinda like my circus. Step right up and visit ring number one. The show's just begun, meet the president. I am here to see that the laws get done. The ringmaster of the government. On with the show! Hurry, hurry, hurry to ring number two. See what they do in the Congress. Passing laws and juggling bills. Oh, it's quite a thrill in the Congress. Focus your attention on ring number three. The judiciary's in the spotlight. The courts take the laws and they tame the crimes, balancing the wrongs with your rights. No one part can be more powerful than any other is. Each controls the other, you see, and that's what we call checks and balance. Says, well, everybody's act is part of the show, and no one's job is more important. The audience is kinda like the country, keeping an eye on their performance. Ring one, executive. Two is legislative, that's Congress. Ring three, judiciary. See, it's kinda like my circus. My circus. I'm gonna have a three-ring circus someday. People will say it's a fine one, son. But until I get it, I'll do my thing. With government, it's got free.